We're live in person. I'm super excited about this. Thank you all for coming. My name is Todd Carpenter. I'm the Executive Director of NISO. We're going to be talking about controlled digital lending. It's just lending, really, but it needs standards. It needs best practices in our community. So joining us both in person and virtually. Again, my name is Todd. Jennie Halperin, who is Executive Director at Library Futures. She is going to be joining us virtually in a second. Chris Freeland, Director of Open Libraries at the Internet Archive, also joining us virtually. And Sebastian Hammer, who is founder at IndexData, is here live in person. Libraries have been sharing content for years. That's what libraries exist to do. And controlled digital lending is merely a new technological approach to circulating content. During the course of the pandemic, when most libraries shut their physical locations, they turned to controlled digital lending as an approach to circulate the content that they have in their institutions. It's not actually new technology. A number of institutions have been using CDL in a variety of forms over the years. Jennie will get into much more of that. But as this new approach has been adopted, what we're finding is we really need to develop new technology standards, new understandings about how this type of circulation happens and how it fits into existing systems, or possibly what new systems exist should be developed to help support this type of circulation. So you might have heard about a month ago, 6 weeks ago, NISO received some funding from the Mellon Foundation, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Greatly appreciate their support in this, to advance some standards work related to best practices in systems designs related to controlled digital lending. We want to do this in order to reduce the perceived risks, reduce the implementation costs, because many institutions are building bespoke systems in order to work in this controlled digital lending environment. So we want to create a community of practice built around the consensus of controlled digital lending as a practice. What's important from a NISO perspective is we're not getting into the many legal issues, the many copyright battles that are taking place in this space. What we at NISO are interested in is not giving guidance in terms of when you should use controlled digital lending, but if you're going to apply controlled digital lending in your institution, here are a set of standards and best practices on how to do so. The choice about when to apply it is up to all of your individual institutions, but this is just another tool in your toolkit for serving your patrons. So that's the NISO perspective. Later presentations are going to talk about some of those issues, but at least from a NISO perspective, we're focused on how do we reduce risks and increase efficiency using this approach. So with that, I'm going to pass on to Jennie, who can, I'll run your slides. Jennie, just let me know when you want me to move forward.
Great, thank you so much, Todd. I'm going to switch my screen so that I can kind of see what's next. So thank you all for coming to this presentation. We really have a lot of people here, and thank you for supporting the Charleston conference this year, and thank you to all organizers, and particularly thank you to Todd and to NISO for putting together this panel. This is my first time at Charleston, and I'd just like to say, you know, next year in Charleston, right? I'm coming to you from Boston. You might catch a glimpse of my dog behind me during this presentation, which I certainly couldn't get in person. But again, I would love to be in the room with all of you. Next slide. So what is controlled digital lending? Controlled digital lending was coined by Georgetown law librarian and professor Michelle Wu almost 20 years ago. She thought of the concept when her library in Houston was flooded. And so she started to ask herself, you know, if these materials were available digitally, if there was a loan to owned or an owned to loaned ratio of copies of them, then it would be a much better use of funds and of funding to be able to lend them out in a controlled manner, in a copyright respecting manner, that would allow a variety of people to access them. CDL, or controlled digital lending, is, I'll use these interchangeably, is in practice at libraries across the country and around the world. Copyright respecting lending is what libraries do, as the subject of the talk says. The conversation and the practice has picked up because of the pandemic and the Internet Archive's National Emergency Library, which provided access to the Internet Archive books for a short period of time last year, which Chris will talk a little bit about in just a moment. CDL is a better use of public funds. And so I will go over, the 4 reasons, the 4 equity reasons that we have written in policy papers about why controlled digital lending. It can support libraries in times of disaster like flood or pandemic or fire. And the last is that it keeps the own to loan ratio. So the most important thing to remember, next slide, is that CDL is lend like print. So if I have 1 copy digitally, you can lend 1 copy physically. It's controlled. That is in the name, and that is what it means. And so when CDL is appropriately tailored, it means that it is permissible under existing copyright law, and I'll go into that in the next slide. And again, it's not intended to act as a substitute for licensing. It exists to create a different situation, and one that is much closer to the way that libraries are used to lending. And so the white paper and the statement go into much more detail, but this is a quick overview. Controlled digital lending is evolving, and it's growing as communities express their needs. So I'll talk in a moment about controlled digital lending implementers, which is a community of practice around this. And in the time that they've existed, we've seen all sorts of different implementations, from libraries using Google Drive or Microsoft SharePoint to do CDL, to more robust systems in Alma or in other library systems. Next slide. So what is the legal support for CDL, you might ask? I'm not a lawyer, but I had the opportunity to go through Copyright First Responders, so I know a little bit about this. Plus, there's a wonderful video of Michelle Wu and Kyle Courtney and some of the originators of the CDL statement talking about the legal basis from it from a couple weeks ago from the Program on Information Justice. And I don't think those videos are up yet, but definitely keep an eye out for them. But the sort of 2 bases for controlled digital lending is first sale and the common law exhaustion principle, which is, if you buy it, you can do with it what you will, and also exhaustion and fair use. And so Michelle and many other lawyers say that CDL is fair use. It is a fundamentally different usage of digital materials in a way that is copyright respecting and potentially transformative. Next slide. So why CDL? Next slide. So this is a recent statement that a cooperative group of librarians put out around using controlled digital lending as a mechanism for interlibrary loan. And this is here to provide an example of the many robust ways in which people are considering controlled digital lending as a crucial aspect of the digital lending ecosystem, particularly within library practices that are well established, such as interlibrary loan. And so CDL, ILL, lending, digital library systems, it all should fit together. And library ownership at the end of the day is the way in which libraries are able to do this. And again, this is not necessarily about licenses or bestsellers or even the hegemony of overdrive. It's really about questions of the 20th century problem of ensuring that materials that a library rightfully owns and has digitized, that the library can make that available in a controlled manner to their patrons. And we really saw this come up during the pandemic, as would be expected. So next slide. Chris is going to talk a little bit about our policy paper as well. Oh, I think we skipped a slide. So I think go back one. For some reason, there's not a slide 11 is not showing up. And I'm not, oh, that's so strange. Well, so slide 11, maybe go back one more. Great. So slide 11 has a screenshot of our blog post on controlled digital lending, unlocking the library's full potential, which is a policy paper that we wrote with Georgetown's Intellectual Property and Information Policy Clinic. And in that paper, we defined 4 main equity issues within controlled digital lending. CDL maximizes economic efficiency and opportunity for communities. CDL improves the civil rights function of libraries. CDL democratizes knowledge by expanding access, and CDL improves the civil rights function of libraries. All of these points are gone into much more detail in the paper, which you can access on our blog. And if anybody's in the chat, I will also drop it into the chat. We also hosted a recent webinar to discuss the paper with the students who wrote it, as well as Amanda Lewandowski, who supervised the students. It's fantastic, and it really provides an excellent basis in why this matters sort of beyond a legal context and why it matters within more of a social justice context. So speaking of which, next slide. This is an interesting story that I think has come up a lot for us. So the scientist, Lindsay Marr, who has an excellent Twitter presence if you don't follow her. So she had read a footnote in a paper that had predicted aerosol spread for COVID viruses, and she could not find it anywhere. The only copy she could find online was $500, and this was a side project for her. She could not afford it, and she was at Virginia Tech, and so she contacted her library. The library asked around and finally found a digital copy in Michigan. They were able to lend that book to her in a controlled way, and through that, Marr and her team were able to prove that COVID was aerosol long before the WHO. And so this is another example of why this matters from a social point of view, as well as from a legal point of view. So next slide. I hope that one shows up. Yeah, we got that one. So just some testimonials from the Internet Archive's Empowering Libraries campaign. So I just want to be clear that CDL is just what libraries do, but it supercharges or it unlocks the full potential of what they can do by providing the maximum amount of resources to the maximum amount of people, and by doing it digitally as people gain more expectations for digital content. Next slide. So there are a number of communities of practice around CDL, but I want to draw attention to 2. One is the controlled digital lending implementers with whom we work very closely, and of course, Library Futures, which is the organization I run. So CDL is in use at hundreds of libraries in many different ways. And this community of practice is a way to see the different ways in which people and companies and different organizations are using or supporting CDL. Next slide. And so I'll just kind of run through these quickly so this doesn't become too much of a promo for Library Futures. We are building a coalition for folks who want to engage with this issue and talk about this issue, as well as who want to come together in coalition to support a more technology positive and forward vision for libraries. Next slide. And our work centers around 5 key areas, which is technology, education, advocacy, legislation, and community. Next slide. If you are interested in getting involved, please get in touch. My email is below, and I will also drop it into the chat. And I think we have Chris next.
Yes. Thanks, Jenny. I'm seeing the notices in the chat that people are maybe having trouble seeing the slides. I think maybe that's been fixed or not. But here's what I'll do as I go through my talk. I'll make sure to just try to describe what's on the slides. I'm Chris Freeland. I'm the director of the Open Libraries program at the Internet Archive, and I've been working with controlled digital lending for almost 4 years now in my role as working with the Internet Archive. I am a librarian. I come to library practice through biology. I have a lot of experience in digitizing materials first that were in the public domain, scientific literature, through my role as the technical director of the Biodiversity Heritage Library. That's actually how I came to know about the Internet Archive, because we partnered with them. The BHL is an international consortium of the world's leading natural history libraries, and the Internet Archive was a scanning partner. I've also shared into chat here links to the different documents and web pages that I'm going to be sharing here in my talk today, which are all shared on Twitter. And you can find me on Twitter at Chris Freeland. On the next slide, please. So the Internet Archive has been using controlled digital lending for more than 10 years to make our library available. So, you know, the Internet Archive, may be surprising to some people, but in addition to our digital work, you know, and the Wayback Machine of archiving the web and other projects, we have a physical collection. We purchase books, we acquire books from libraries that are either closing or donating their collections. So physical materials. We take those physical materials, we digitize them, and we make the digitized version available through controlled digital lending. And the physical book sits in our physical archive and it doesn't circulate. And as I mentioned, we've been doing controlled digital lending for 10 years now, starting with libraries in the Boston area and now going to libraries all over the United States, in Canada, and elsewhere. What I'm showing here on the slide is a screenshot of the Internet Archive's implementation of controlled digital lending. So as Jennie mentioned, you know, there are lots of documents that are describing controlled digital lending and lots of legal writing about how controlled digital lending works. At the Internet Archive, we have implemented a controlled digital lending, and the way that it works for us is that is what you're seeing here. So when you come into a book at the Internet Archive, you can view the front matter and the back matter, but not the book itself. To read the book, you have to check out the book. So you are, just as the title of this talk suggests, library controlled digital lending is just lending. And so when you're checking out a book from the Internet Archive, you are just checking out a book. It happens to be online. And so once you've logged in, once you're logged in, you can check out a book. And at the Internet Archive, you can check out up to 5 books at a time through our controlled digital lending environment. On the next slide. So unfortunately, that practice, though 10 years old and well established, is the subject of a lawsuit. And so in June of last year, 4 of the world's largest publishers brought a lawsuit against the Internet Archive for controlled digital lending and the National Emergency Library that Jennie mentioned. Now, the National Emergency Library is closed. It was a temporary effort that was with the goal of connecting kids with books while their schools and their libraries closed overnight, in some cases last spring. The National Emergency Library ran for 84 days and closed 2 weeks early. And it was beyond controlled digital lending. And we were upfront about that from the start. But the lawsuit is actually about controlled digital lending and not exclusively about the National Emergency Library. Controlled digital lending is the true target and what the publishers are hoping to stop. On the next slide. Beyond the lawsuit, there are other groups that are not in support of controlled digital lending. And unfortunately, some of them put out misinformation and intentional disinformation about how controlled digital lending actually works. And so you might have encountered some of that online in your own work and explorations of, well, is that right? I mean, a lot of things that we hear, one of the things that comes up all the time is, well, we can't scan an entire book. Actually, you can. And that's part of why we did this session, this myth-busting session for controlled digital lending. And so we wanted to counter the misinformation so that people could make an informed decision on how controlled digital lending actually works. So we brought together experts and we busted the 10 most common myths that we encounter online about controlled digital lending. That session was recorded. It's quite popular. We have it available at the Internet Archive, and that also was shared in the links that I shared at the top. So it's really useful to have this document, not only the video recording but the supporting information, so that you can be informed and you can make a good decision about how controlled digital lending could work for your library as implemented, within your local control. On the next slide, we did another session. So following from myth busting, then another session that we put together. This happened in the summer, this summer, of frequently asked questions about controlled digital lending. And again, we did the same thing. We crowdsourced the most common questions about CDL, and we brought together a panel of experts to answer them, just like the myth busting format. On the next slide, what I'd like to do now is go into an environmental scan, because even though there is a lawsuit against controlled digital lending, what I'd like to say is that the work of the community, of the library community, and expressing and describing how controlled digital lending works is working. So controlled digital lending is now used by hundreds of libraries, and drawing statements of support from important and international organizations. On the next slide, like IFLA, who issued a really very strong statement of support for controlled digital lending in June of this year. And early in the statement, the authors highlight the economic case for controlled digital lending. And on the next slide, you'll see the piece and highlighted here, the thing that I think is just really important, which is that the authors wrote, a key reason why CDL is necessary is the failure of markets to provide access to works in digital form on a consistently fair basis. Now, the rest of the statement is equally strongly worded, and I would encourage everyone to read the full statement. And it's great, really, to see this from an international leader in the space like IFLA. On the next slide, Jennie mentioned the work that Library Futures has done with the CDL, Unlocking the Library's Full Potential. So we did do that session last month, I guess it was, with Library Futures and Georgetown Law. So those two organizations collaborated on the document, and then last month we held a webinar to review the policy doc and to talk about it. So that session is also online and also online and shared in my links. So on the next slide, something that I think is really interesting, when I've been talking about controlled digital lending, as I mentioned, for 4 years now, and I literally sat in front of thousands of librarians talking about CDL. And one of the things that I love to see is when the questions start coming around to resource sharing, as librarians and professionals are looking at, well, how could CDL be integrated into my library operations? When we get to resource sharing, that's where I see like the light bulb is coming on. So there are organizations that are thinking about how controlled digital lending and interlibrary loan work together. And so in September, the Boston Library Consortium, of which the Internet Archive is a member, but we're not part of this document that I'm about to describe. The Boston Library Consortium announced its plans to implement controlled digital lending for interlibrary loan. Library Futures has also put out a statement describing how CDL and interlibrary loan work together. So lots of people thinking about how can controlled digital lending be used in resource sharing. The library practice of controlled digital lending meets up very well with the existing library practice of interlibrary loan. So on the next slide, you'll see that controlled digital lending isn't just being considered by organizations in the United States. We saw that earlier with the IFLA statement with an international library organization. But last month, the Research Libraries UK released a thought piece making the case for controlled digital lending in the UK. On the next slide, as Jennie mentioned, the community of practice around controlled digital lending through the controlled digital lending implementers is really thriving. And it's one of the best ways of staying up to date on what's happening with controlled digital lending. And that group now hosts monthly meetings. And I think it's really fun. For years, the Internet Archive was one of the few convening libraries that was bringing together groups of people to talk about controlled digital lending. And in the past 2 years, we've now seen that there's this thriving community of practice that's grown up around the library practice of CDL. And to make a point that I've made before, but it's worth underscoring, the controlled digital lending implementers group, the Internet Archive participates in, but we are not anything to do with the organization of it. In fact, we had to ask to join and to be part of the conversation. So it's really satisfying to see now where the Internet Archive used to be one of the only conveners for the library practice. It's now really a thriving community of practice, and with hundreds of libraries that are now participating. Next slide, please. And so what I think is really showing that thriving community of practice is that there are a number of vendors in the space and library technology vendors who have made public statements about how they are incorporating CDL into their products, like EBSCO here describing how CDL will make its way into Folio. And then on the next slide, you'll see that ExLibris has also done white papers and other documentation about how they plan to implement controlled digital lending into Rapido and to other products. So I think that's really interesting. It speaks to the library vendors are responding to the needs expressed by their customers, saying we need to be able to do controlled digital lending. So I see this as a strong statement in support of controlled digital lending that vendors are incorporating it into their program. And so on my last slide, I'll say my final takeaways are this. There are more libraries than ever before that are using controlled digital lending to reach their patrons. And there are more readers and researchers who are accessing books through controlled digital lending than ever before. So what I see with controlled digital lending is that the future is bright and the community is thriving because controlled digital lending solves real world problems for libraries and for the communities we serve. Thanks.
Thanks, Chris.
All right, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Todd, and everybody. Thank you all for being here. I would like to try to bring things back a little bit in the direction of concrete library requirements and processes, and some of the things that make me excited about the initiative that NISO is undertaking. About me first, I have been involved in library technology for the past 30 years or so, for the past 27 years as part of IndexData. I still get stupidly excited about making software systems talk together, enabling better collaboration and flow of data between systems and people. And that's kind of what I've made my vision, my mission. I am also really interested in approaches to try to rethink the ways that we talk about software systems together. So a lot of what we've done at IndexData has been thinking about ways that we can break down some of the barriers and the boxes that we put ourselves in. I'm a vendor, you are a library. I'm really interested in ways that we can bring everybody around the same table and think about strategic challenges and how we unfold solutions to those challenges and how we turn that into software. So a big part of that particular aspect of my passion has unfolded in our involvement in Project Reshare over the past 3 years. So I'm on the steering committee of Project Reshare as part of, in addition to being involved with IndexData, and Reshare is a community of consortia and libraries and software developers that have come together to build technologies and platforms to support resource sharing and collaboration between libraries and consortia and elsewhere. And we started a conversation about CDL as part of our larger vision somewhere around the beginning of the pandemic. And a lot of that conversation is really what I'm excited about bringing into this work that's coming. I want to say next slide, but it's all on me, I guess. So we first got excited thinking about CDL and Project Reshare because we realized that just architecturally and technically, there are a lot of pieces in common between what you might think of as a really strong implementation of CDL that are common with a resource sharing solution. The ability to talk to a local library management system to determine what materials you hold, the ability to deliver documents electronically. There are lots of these pieces where we thought, hey, we as a project are really well positioned to build tooling and technology to support this. But as we started to dig into what that might look like, we also began to realize, as Chris pointed out too, that when you combine CDL with interlibrary loan and consortial collaboration, you really are supercharging the whole machinery. You can start to think about spreading the load, the workload of scanning documents. You can think about the physical holdings of the entire consortium as being instantly available across library boundaries. So there were a lot of things that made us really excited. And this sort of drive was part of what motivated Project Reshare to co-found the CDL implementers group. So I'm one of the members of the steering committee of that group. And that's been where we've had some of this conversation as well. So really, the conversation we've had in Reshare about CDL has been, yes, it's a very widely adopted practice. Hundreds of libraries literally are doing CDL every day, but it's still in some ways a fringe activity, in that many libraries are kind of left to their own devices and are making up their own technologies and kind of MacGyvering their own solutions for delivering documents. There is, I think, a gap here where there's a real opportunity for us to define what do we think of, how do we see CDL fitting into mainstream approaches to providing access to resources in library? How does it fit into workflows? What do we need library technology to do to enable really streamlined CDL processes? And that was the conversation we began in the project. So we're excited about consortial CDL, but as a first step, we're really interested in kind of backing down and looking at what, if we take the abstractions of the CDL white paper and we interpret them from a perspective of library processes and workflows and policies, what might that look like? And this is one sketch that we came up with. If you look at the top row here, we have activities like scanning documents and file management and applying DRM, delivering files to patrons that lots and lots of libraries have figured out different approaches to doing over the past several years. But in the middle are types of processes that many libraries either have had to make up of their own, or they simply don't do them because they lack the ability to build deep integrations with the library management system. They may be forced to limit their CDL activities to certain parts of their collection, things that they can sequester off, or maybe to course reserved materials. We were really asking, what would it look like to build a CDL solution that you could apply to any part of your collection at will, right? So we want to think about the ability to approve requests in an automated way, to model policies within the library, and to make those policies actionable against different parts of your collection. That's part of it. We want to be able to support local processes and workflows. We want to be able to print pick slips to tell a staffer to go pick up a material and go scan it if it's not already been scanned, or to take it off the shelf and put it off in a separate area if it's been lent digitally. We want to be able to support those physical workflows. We want to be able to communicate with the patrons in an effective way. And finally, we want to ultimately enable interlibrary loan through CDL. So figuring out the mechanisms needed to support lending between libraries in a consortium and elsewhere. And you can start to see sort of the outlines of types of mechanisms that you need to support, types of integrations that you might need with the local system. So for instance, you need ways to identify your patron from a CDL system to determine that that patron is in good standing. You need to be able to determine the real-time availability of your physical copies, so you can decide whether your own to loan ratio is being correctly balanced. And you need to be able to check materials in and out. And I think that starts to point at the types of things that we will want to think about standardizing. The codifying the processes and elements of policy, I think, is an area that you don't want to overlook. I think especially in collaborations between libraries, it would be really useful to start to take some of the concepts that are laid out in broad terms in the CDL white paper and make them really specific, and even ideally to make them machine readable, so I can post a profile of my library and what my library is prepared to do for my patrons and for other libraries in a precise and machine readable way. We want to define the interactions with the ILS. If we imagine the CDL system being separate, whether it's internal to the ILS or separate, it needs a way to say check out materials. What does that look like? We have APIs like NSIP already in place, but how do you actually go about checking out material and indicating in a way to your ILS that that checkout is digital as opposed to physical? How do you capture that? What's the best practice for doing that so that you can do accurate reporting and tracking and auditing later on? You need to figure out the right way to integrate your CDL services with your discovery layer, either for your individual library or for your consortium. And finally, there's this whole space of what does the collaboration between libraries look like? How do we fit interlibrary CDL into our discovery approaches? How do we place requests? How do we manage how do we extend the trust and the mechanisms we have for managing trust between libraries into the digital realm? All these things, I think, are a really rich vein of material that we need to flesh out. And I'm excited about this project because from my perspective, NISO provides an ideal platform for all of us to come together as a community and decide how we want to do these things, as opposed to delegating those decisions to individual vendors or to local libraries kind of making it up on the fly. NISO provides formal mechanisms for us to have those conversations and to record the outputs and recommendations and standards. But moreover, it provides what I think of as kind of a third place for us all to come together in a neutral setting, vendors, developers, libraries, consortia, and talking about how we want this future to unfold. How do we take CDL the next step down the road and really make it a mainstream, deeply integrated part of library operations that everybody can pick up and apply in their library? So that's where I come from and what I'm excited about for this work. And back to Todd to make it real.
Trying to make it real. So just where we stand with this project, we announced the work in September. We are presently forming a working group. Hopefully that working group will be approved by our leadership committee in the next couple of weeks, with a first meeting probably happening in the December-ish timeframe. The goals of this project are to, A, develop some kind of community vocabulary around controlled digital lending so that we're all consistent in our terminology, and then describe and map out existing practice. There is existing practice. What could be extrapolated from that, and where could we go? And then codify that in procedural norms, and then identify gaps in systems which may exist, and how do we fill those gaps, with an outreach probably in an 18-month time frame for a public draft for review, and then publication of our research outputs, and then possibly looking at a phase 2 of this to actually implement some of those changes, the systems changes. You know, what ILL standard do we need to update the ISO ILL standards to support CDL? Do we need to create new standards or new technology plugins for ILS systems? Those sort of things are reasonable next steps after we have mapped the landscape and kind of developed some of the a better understanding of controlled digital lending and how it's integrated in these systems. So a goal is to have the project release its outputs in 2023, which seems like a long time far away, but really it'll be here faster than we know. So I want to thank all of you for joining us. We have, I think, maybe 10 minutes or so for questions. Do we have any questions or comments from the ether?
We do have questions and comments from the virtual attendees, so we'll start with that. But folks in the audience, if you do have a question, just shout it out and then we'll repeat it into the microphone so everyone's able to fully hear, and our panelists, I'm sure, will have lots to say. So if any of you were at the keynote this morning, Paul Sappho referred to, he thinks that librarians can be both fire trucks and also architects. They can fill those two roles. So I think what we heard today was a lot of architecture, and that was great. Librarians as architects, but filling those two roles, we see your colleagues on Pathable, Eileen and Marina, have both asked. We are really struggling with how to do CDL with ebooks because of restrictive licenses. So could any of the panelists comment on those kinds of restrictions and how they might inhibit the growth of this infrastructure?
Jennie, Chris, you want to take a swing at that?
Go for it, Jennie. I know you're fired up on this topic.
I think that's a really good question. And I sometimes hear the advice from folks that's like, don't sign bad licenses, you know, and I think the reality is for many people, for most people, and I would even say for all people, that is not an option. That, you know, in order to get the best resources for patrons, the best way to do so is to sign restrictive licensing agreements. At the same time, as I think Sebastian said, consortia or where it's at, we can come together as a community to think structurally about these licenses and how they are restricting library lending in ways that are equitable and that are fair for our communities and for other communities, frankly. And so I know that sounds like it's a non-answer, but besides leaning on folks for ILL and leaning on other consortium members or other libraries, I'm sorry, I feel like there's a little bit of feedback from the room. Can you mute, Todd? Is there any way to do that? Okay, sorry. So either leaning on consortium members, and then structurally thinking about how libraries and library advocates can come together in a community in order to discuss and also fight back against these contracts. And then I have one last point. So for example, Library Futures is just starting the work to launch a community of practice around these kinds of restrictive contracts, because believe me, in a year of doing this, and for Chris, many years of doing this, we've really heard some horror stories from different libraries and different organizations. And so I believe, and our organization believes, that there is strength in numbers and that coming together and working together is really the best way to address this structurally. And then the last thing I'll say is that when it comes to ebooks, CDL is not necessarily meant to address the issues of licensing. In the last session, Kevin Smith and I'm so sorry, but I cannot remember the other person's name, were discussing how whether or not copyright was still applicable in this time. And she was saying that the issue is with contracts. The issue is not necessarily with copyright. And so Sarah Benson, thank you so much. And I'm so sorry, Sarah, for forgetting. But so Sarah was saying that the issue is with contracts and not necessarily with copyright. And so we are also working on a uniform bill to start to address some of the contracting issues at a structural and legislative level. This is all slow moving work. And I know that it's sort of cold comfort to say, well, come together in a community and work on legislation. So, but those are sort of two pieces of the pie. The last one is to use resources like the archive, like other libraries, like other groups in your consortia who may have, that book digitized, who may have that book in their collection and can lend it to you in a way that is copyright respecting and that keeps the own to loan ratio.
Thanks for that.
Chris, do you have anything to add? Yeah.
If I could just throw one quick thing in, it's that CDL depends on ownership, not licensed material. So you have to own something. And that's kind of one of the challenges in our current e-environment is that we don't actually own what we're paying for. We're just renting it. We're leasing the access to the content. So there's been some questions in chat about, well, does CDL work for born digital material? Yes, but you have to own that. And so like the Internet Archive is working with publisher PM Press, where we purchase outright. We buy PDFs and EPUBs, not license them. We have a receipt, not a license agreement for that transaction. Those materials are in controlled digital lending, and we lend them just the same way we do the other things. We have a mechanism that makes sure we're not exceeding the number of own to loan ratio between the number of of materials that are owned versus the number of copies that are lent.
And thank you for making that clear, Chris. The only way to ensure that CDL works is ownership.
Gotta own it.
Yep. It's crucial for libraries.
That was really two answers to that single question. There's a licensing question around the rental, but then there also is the overwhelming issue there. Is it possible to actually own? So really good point. Any questions from the audience here? We've got a great group in Charleston for our virtual attendees, all socially distanced and all masked, but love to open it to the floor. Any questions for our panel? No, you're masked, you're socially distant, and you're a tad shy today. So I'll throw it back over to Todd. I think we're almost at time.
I do see a question in the chat about why somebody would do CDL with an ebook since it's already digital and available for one simultaneous user. And Chris, would you mind taking that one? Because I feel like you'll have a good.
Yeah,
answer.
I can read that one. I'm sorry, I missed it. Thank
Oh
you.
yeah, no worries.
I'm curious how, and this is from, of course, it just popped off my screen. This is from CDL. I'm curious how CDL might interact with unlimited ebook licenses. If an institution owned a DRM-free title, would it or should it have to be shut down on all of its local access to loan a single instance to another library?
So I think every library has to look at its own agreements and understand what it individually is comfortable in doing and lending using controlled digital lending. So I can't speak necessarily to specific examples, but what I can say is that yes, controlled digital lending does work for born digital materials, but you have to own it. And to another point that's in the chat is perpetual access is not ownership. That's again, did you get a receipt or did you get a license when you paid money for access to that thing? And if you didn't get a receipt, if you just got another license, you don't own it, even if you have perpetual access to it. So you got to own it. And that's digital ownership is so important for us when we think about the library's role in society. The fact that we are not able to preserve materials that we're simply licensing, that really worries me from a preservation point of view.
And that point was from Susan. Not really, she says in the chat, it's a bit of a tangent, not really a tangent. I think it's really germane. But this gets back to licensing. Susan mentions it's usually termed perpetual access, but to Chris's point, that's still not ownership. So, you know,
yeah. I mean,
balance and licensing.
CDL is addressing a problem that exists of trying to get to materials. CDL is addressing some of the issues around the lack of digital ownership for materials that are both in print and available as an ebook. But yeah, we got to own it. We've had success with independent publishers who have sold materials outright, and it's not scary and it works. And I would love to see more publishers embrace the model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm just gonna add to that is that, you know, in its current iteration, licenses are exploiting the public. It is a bold statement to say, but it is true. So when you have so if you are signing a complicated contract that, you know, provides access to something just to you, that really does not mean that your library will have perpetual access to it. If that vendor shuts down, then you have lost it. So, you know, again, the question is, how can libraries come together so that we don't have to have a million independent libraries running a million different versions of the same thing? And that's why I think Sebastian's work is so important, is to really think about the ways in which, you know, we can create groups of libraries who are maintaining digital assets for our future and for our shared future, so that the issues of preservation, issues of ownership, of copyright, are in the hands of the public interest rather than in the hands of individual vendors. You know, if I know that right now we cannot imagine a world in which Elsevier is not a company, but many companies have folded or been acquired or changed, and you know, libraries have then just lost access to all of that material, or that access has become prohibitively expensive. Ownership is the only way both to do CDL and also to make this happen.
Well, I see that we are slightly past our time, but I want to thank you all for joining us. Thanks again to Chris, Sebastian, and Jenny for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your conference. Thank you.
And thanks to all the panelists, and also thanks to our virtual attendees. We had some trouble with the slides. Hopefully you all have access to those now, and they will be posted with the rest of this presentation as part of the Charleston Hub. So thanks everyone, virtual and in person.
So Todd, how many people were in the room?
I'd say about 50.
Oh, fantastic. I don't know if you were able to, there was 250 virtual attendees. I don't know if you saw that.
I didn't see that because I don't have access to that on this computer. That's great. So that's what, like a third of the conference? Well, Chris, we need to get going. Let people in for the next session. So we will talk again soon.
Thanks
Thank
a
you.
lot.